Progressive American. I'm sitting here with congressional candidate Qasim Rashid for the 11th Congressional District. Thank you very much for joining me, Qasim.
It's good to be here, man. How are you?
I'm doing all right. Apologies, everybody, for the delay. I had some technical difficulties with the link. Restream does that on occasion. Uh, no problem. We've got plenty of time. So first off, I
Absolutely.
just wanted to start off pretty simple. One of the reasons I joined your campaign was really wanting to make a serious change in terms of working towards people like actively being able to involve themselves in their local community and also being able to push for change, not just from the corporate framing. So I wanted to get like your perspective on why you first off got involved in politics and then why you're running in this district of all things.
Well, I first got involved years ago, and I think part of it had to do with, when you're an immigrant, when you're a faith minority, when you're a racial minority, you learn very early on that you need to be at the forefront of driving your messaging, your narrative, sharing with the world who you are. You don't get the benefit of being an individual who speaks for themselves. You suddenly represent billions of people. And so I wanted to make sure my narrative was positive. It was reinforced with facts and authenticity. The second part of it is, from a very young age, my parents infused in me this element of being engaged in the community. Service to humanity was kind of a driving factor of my upbringing. And it's what drove me to go to law school as well, a big part of it. And having worked in advocacy to support survivors of domestic violence, asylum seekers, prison reform, expanding healthcare and education access, climate justice, these are all things that I've worked really hard to improve over the last 15 years. Running for office now is to transform that advocacy for human rights into better policy. And to answer your question about why this district, I mean, this is the district I grew up in. My family moved to Illinois back in 1988 when I was 5 years old, well before you were born. And I went away for law school and even ran. But now that I'm back home, these issues and values that I care deeply about, where my roots are things that it's not possible for me to just ignore. And for me, it's about making sure we have representation that is people funded, that reflects the will of the people. Governor Pat Quinn said it best at an event a few weeks ago I was at, where he said that you should run so that the will of the people is the law of the land. And that's the focus that I'm working on right now.
Yeah, and it's really nice to see not only just somebody running because they obviously care about the issues, but it's also nice to see that they are very connected to the community and actually have like a childhood story to it. And kind of hitting on that note, we've seen both on this side of like immigration and also being part of the local community. Is a backlash, I think, to the rights of immigrants. Recently, the Naperville Sun had a piece out about City Council member Josh McBroom, where he basically claimed that nobody was interested in housing the migrants who were bused here from Texas and Florida. And it turned out through Freedom of Information requests that not only were people actively reaching out, but that they were not getting the information they requested when Josh McBroom had basically said, "Hey, I'm willing to talk to people who are actively interested." And then when it turns out people are actually a lot more open to migrants, he seemed to not care. But going on that, one of the things you've mentioned is being able to protect migrant rights from that kind of reaction. And recently, we've had the Biden administration attempted to put forward a deal that was arguably more draconian than most people would like uh, to to talk about. So I was wondering if we could get your thoughts on that, and then also how do we fix or repair the immigration system so it can humanely process people who are in desperate need?
At the end of the day, we have to recognize that this country has never had a just immigration policy. Let's not even begin talking about the transatlantic slave trade, which wasn't immigration; it was human trafficking. Uh, Post Civil War, you had massive Chinese immigration, and Chinese Americans, people forget, were some of our first labor leaders and fought for labor rights valiantly and helped raise wages for workers. But the backlash, as you mentioned just a minute ago, was the anti-Chinese acts, the Chinese Exclusion Acts of 1882, that eventually culminated into the Asiatic Exclusion League, and then a full ban on basically all non-white immigration by 1924, and that was in effect till about 1965. And so, for the first nearly 200 years of this country, you really had a ban on any non-white immigration whatsoever, at least voluntary. Post that, we see this consistent refusal to acknowledge what we need to accommodate our immigrant population, or people who are immigrants as well. And one of the big myths out there is that immigrants somehow harm the economy. A recent study just came out that even undocumented immigrants have added $7 trillion to the U.S. economy. They pay at least $12 billion in taxes, for which they get zero benefit whatsoever. So I think the solution here is there's three main things we can take, and none of these are pie in the sky ideas. One, we need to invest heavily in immigration judges and attorneys to process the asylum seekers. Look, asylum is a human right. We shouldn't be putting people in limbo for 2, 3 years, 4 years. We should be able to process these claims a lot faster. It'll make our border more secure, more palatable, more manageable. Two, we need to recognize the massive economic impact. If we have a worker visa program that would allow migrant workers to come here to work agricultural jobs, there's 4.5 million agricultural jobs that go either unfilled or are trafficked. And by having a worker visa program, farms, even small farms, especially small farms, can get the support they need. We can get the produce we need, and our economy can strive and be stronger. And then three, a pathway to citizenship for DACA and for Dreamers. This is, again, President of the Democrats put together a pretty comprehensive immigration bipartisan plan back in 2013. John Boehner refused to bring it to a vote. Terrible decision. And then in response, President Obama issued, executive orders, DACA and DAPA and a few others. And then Republicans claimed, well, that's tyrannical. Well, when you refuse to govern and say, figure it out yourself, then the president's going to do what's within his power. But the reality is that even, back in 2013 and now again in 2024, Republicans are blocking bipartisan legislation. And then I will add, in addition to those three very practical steps, we need to also recognize the impact of climate change on migration and the impact of foreign interventionism, our U.S. foreign interventionism in South America and Central American countries. That impacts migration, and it would be naive for us to think that destabilizing a government doesn't result in people migrating from that country. But it starts with this humane aspect of recognizing that immigrants are human beings, that when we talk about get in line, well, we need to make sure the line isn't 10 years long. We need to make sure there is practical and viable strategies to go forward. I've done immigration law for many years. It's incredibly complicated. It doesn't need to be. And that starts by recognizing the humanity of immigrants, upholding international human rights law in terms of asylum, and building better infrastructure so that immigrants can get the resources they need quicker and faster, so that we can avoid exploitation or trafficking and stick to the actual line, which it would be a sustainable line at that point.
Yeah, and just speaking on a little bit of personal experience, obviously I'm not a migrant. I've never experienced what it's like from that perspective. But I do remember in college that there were people I knew personally whose status was upended
Yeah.
because they were never really able to trust the system when DACA was first proposed, and then when people started thinking about taking it away, they had no recourse, even though they were brought here as children. And what's really disturbing to me, at least, is this view that the law is more important than the humanity of people who really had no agency in how they came here in the first place. And as you mentioned, who are in dire circumstances that our policies just do not meet. And on that note, I would say the other thing is that we've got an element of just plain prejudice, like baseline nativist xenophobia. And I was wondering, like, what role would you play, as you have played, in combating that rhetorically, politically, and any other policy procedures you think would be good for protecting people who are in a vulnerable status?
Well, I think it starts with representation. I mean, representation matters. It's fundamentally, let's just be very clear about this. Representation matters. Let's take it to a very obvious example. If we had 9 Black women on the Supreme Court right now, do you really think we would be debating whether racism exists? Do you think we'd be debating whether there's been a legacy of Jim Crow, or a legacy of slavery, or a legacy of denying women basic economic access till 1974? Of course not, right? And so the fact that right now our electeds look nothing like the American people in terms of demographics, and I don't just mean racial demographics. I'm not talking about even race or gender, but even from an economic status, right? The median household income is $52,000 a year. The average person in Congress is a multimillionaire. My opponent is worth $15, $20 million. And so part of it is making sure that we have representation in Congress. I grew up in Section 8 housing. I know what it's like to have to work since you were 15 to put food on the table, to pay for food with food stamps. I know what it's like not to know if you have enough gas money to get to work or to get back, and just having to walk because there's not the car's not starting. You just got to walk home and figure out a way tomorrow to get a ride from a friend. I've experienced these, and I also understand the struggle it takes to get out of that. Right? It's very expensive to be poor in this country, and there's a lot of shame associated with it. Poverty is not a life choice. We can't tolerate policies or politicians who make it a life sentence. So immediately off the bat, by getting elected on a 100% people-funded campaign, you will know that you have a representative in Congress who understands the struggles of hundreds of millions of Americans. 62% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck right now. Second, it's enacting those policies. What does economic, social, and climate justice look like? Well, economic justice to me looks like making sure everybody has access to guaranteed universal health care, regardless of your economic status. Everybody has access to a living wage, that we aren't suffering under the climate crisis because politicians like my opponent think we can wait until 2050 to go carbon neutral when all the scientists are telling us we need to go, we need to get there by 2030 or sooner. Social justice looks like signing HR 40, a bill to study reparations for African Americans. My opponent refused to sign it. Social justice looks like co-sponsoring HR 3103, which says that our tax dollars should not be used to indefinitely detain Palestinian children in Israeli prisons. These are basic human rights that are being denied because a person in power right now in this seat is so focused on repeatedly voting with Republicans to repeal Obamacare, repeatedly voting with Republicans to strip down the Americans with Disabilities Act, voting with Republicans to deregulate banks, voting with Republicans for offshore drilling. These are all nonsensical things, contrary not just to democratic values, but to the values of the majority of Americans. And we get to a place of meaningful representation by electing people who are funded by the people, who work with the people, and live their careers serving the people. This, again, fundamentally for me, is about transforming my advocacy for humanity into policy for humanity, so that when you go to your member of Congress, you're talking to someone who has struggled through the economic struggles that every person in America has gone through at some point, and you know that the votes I make are going to be reflective of lifting people out of that struggle, not perpetuating the wealth divide, which has been happening for decades right now.
Yeah, and I that's kind of actually one of the reasons in my grad school work I've been focusing on women's recruitment and descriptive representation, because the more you have of a group of people, the more their interests will be transformed into
Sure.
substantive representation.
Yep.
But the other thing is, and I'm really glad you brought this up, is climate change. A lot of what has been discussed about climate change, unfortunately on the right, it's kind of ignored or seen as a panic. Um, is the role of access to water, clean,
Yeah.
effective water that everybody can use. And one of the things I think we're starting to see, it, particularly in Latin America, but we'll also see this in the Middle East as well, is a lack of access to safe drinkable water, which leads to shifts in migration. So if we don't like look at climate change as a policy, as a matter of maintaining healthy immigration policy and safe and humane immigration policy, we're going to be back here again. But to go back to what you said about Foster and his campaign, or perhaps lack thereof, uh, when it comes to your debate with him, one of the things he hit on the universal healthcare front was that he was an incrementalist. And I was wondering what was your reaction to that? What are your thoughts on that? Because a lot of times when people talk about universal healthcare, they've only talk about it from the framework of, well, we can get it tomorrow. And as much as I can be a bit of an incrementalist, it would be a little nice to see like what is the answer to people who hold that label.
Being an incrementalist is great when you're worth $20 million. You're a wealthy white male who's never had to be discriminated against for some immutable characteristic, never had to suffer through poverty, or not know how you're going to put gas in your car, or where rent's going to come from, or how you're going to pay for your kids' incurable autoimmune disease. That's who an incrementalist is great for. People who want to maintain the status quo. James Baldwin, one of the great civil rights leaders of the 20th century, who died young of stomach cancer in his last few years of his life. He was about 58 years old. And he is asked by a journalist about time, about time for there to be meaningful change. And he says to the journalist, really angrily, he goes, "What is it that you want me to reconcile myself to? You've always told me it takes time. Well, it's taken," he goes, "I've lived here almost 60 years. I'm not going to live another 60. You keep telling me it takes time. It's taken my mother's time and my father's time, my brother's time and my sister's time, my aunt's time and my uncle's time. How much time do you want for your progress? Right now, we are living at a time where 70,000 Americans a year are dying due to lack of healthcare access. 500,000 are filing for medical bankruptcy. We're living at a time globally where 5 million people, according to the World Health Organization, die annually due to climate change related causes. And we're seeing the hottest temperatures on recorded history happening every single year, setting a brand new record. We're seeing the worst wealth and income inequality right now in the last 100 years. Even after the Great Depression, we're worse now than after the Great Depression. To look at all these existential crises, the opioid crisis is killing 6 times as many people now as it was 30 years ago. And to look at all these crises and say, you know what the solution is? Let's slow down as much as possible, right? When you're driving head on into a wall, you don't tap the brakes. You slam on the brakes as hard as you possibly can to prevent this collision from becoming irreparable harm. And that's the difference between Bill Foster and I. He has no urgency of the struggles and harms that people are suffering through right now. I've been through them myself. I see them every day with my clients that I support, the survivors of domestic and sexual violence, the people who are homeless or unhoused, looking for a place to live, the people who don't know where the next meal is coming from. Myself, I can give you my own example. My daughter has an incurable autoimmune disease that we've been spending $1,000 a month on top of our premiums just to get her the basic medication she needs to live. And now that that medication is no longer effective, we've been rejected 4 times by an insurance company through the ACA, mind you, that Bill Foster keeps praising as the be all end all. We've been rejected 4 times for the medication that doctors say she needs to live. That medicine costs $250,000 a year. And they're saying, you go figure it out yourself. We're not going to pay for it. He wants me to go to my daughter and say, sweetheart, let me give you some incremental advice. Wait until you're 22 years old, get a job, make sure it's corporate paying, make sure it has the gold standard healthcare, and then you can get the basic healthcare you need, which you need to live right now. It's nonsensical, it's offensive, and it's tone deaf. We need leaders who are going to lead with justice and recognize that justice can't wait. Because when you don't have food to put on your kid's plate, telling that person we're going to have incremental progress is not enough. It's not good enough. We need to have change now, and that is possible. None of the stuff I'm talking about is pie in the sky. It is possible. It is within our grasp. In fact, if you don't believe me, go back and listen to Dr. King's Nobel Peace Prize winning speech way back in the 1960s when he talked about, for the first time in human history, we are at a place in life where it is no longer a matter of scarcity of resources. We have enough to feed everyone. We have enough to provide healthcare to everyone. We need to provide that access. And the fact that we have politicians who stand in the way of that progress is a reflection of why we need more people-funded people in Congress, not corporate-funded multimillionaires funded by billion-dollar corporations for so-called incremental progress.
Yeah, and the other thing is I would buy an incremental argument if it wasn't for the history of voting against actual like improvement. Like
Right.
from my perspective, if I were to say take the incremental position and be like, oh, I would like to see increases in access to healthcare to get to universal healthcare. I will vote for the 2 million increase in people who are going to be covered, even though that's not my final goal. But as you've mentioned repeatedly, that has not been the case with Foster's record. But moving on from Foster, since he is not here, I would like to kind of get into your discussion surrounding LGBTQ rights. As you know, we unfortunately do have a hate group out in this area called Awake Illinois, and they have really championed what they see as protecting children, but that seems to also exclude trans children. And I was wondering if, let's say, you're Congressman Qasim Rashid, and you now have the opportunity to take federal action to protect not only just representation of LGBTQ people, but also to protect libraries that receive threats. What would you do on the legislative level to deal with some of these far right extremists when it comes to protecting LGBTQ representation and rights?
I mean, this is an example to me of how we have solutions. We need people in power with the courage and the conviction to push through. I mean, the Equality Act needs to pass fundamentally, right, to ban LGBTQ discrimination on a federal scale. We also need to invest more resources in anti-bullying for youth. It's no accident that LGBTQ youth suffer a higher rate of self-harm, suicide, and homelessness, right? The resources simply aren't there. I think we're all mortified and horrified by the brutal beating death of Nex Benedict, a trans child in Oklahoma. I was heartened to see children walk out in protest of Nex's brutal murder. And the fact that there isn't more meaningful accountability is a reflection of how much more work we need to do, and also why we need more young people to be leading the charge here. Look, at the end of the day, this is a fundamental human rights issue, and the violence and persecution perpetrated against LGBTQ Americans, particularly youth, is not only unacceptable and immoral and horrifying. We need to recognize that if we don't nip this in the bud, if we don't actively be anti-bigots to this violence, it's going to get worse. Bigots don't stop with just hate. They proceed to violence, and then they keep pushing violence until they get whatever it is they want. And so for me, it's critical that we are open, outspoken, and absolutely adamant on the humanity of LGBTQ Americans. Passing the Equality Act is a big step. Investing heavily in protecting youth is a big step. But it goes, again, even to the legal spectrum. Like it's legal for a lawyer in jury selection to exclude somebody because they identify as queer. I mean, it's mind-boggling that in 2024 that's still a reality. But that's another example of how even the criminal justice system or the civil justice system, there's discrimination that can be easily remedied by making sure we are clear in our principles of justice and advocating for the humanity of all Americans, including, of course, LGBTQ Americans.
Oh, I thank you for that, because one of the things that has been especially concerning is the attempted censorship of histories surrounding LGBTQ people,
Right.
and that's something that's near and dear to my heart, even though I'm not a member of the LGBTQ community. But a because it's history, and B because it's just the basic representation of all of our people. But moving on to something that has been you've been asked about quite a bit, and that's Israel Palestine.
Yeah.
I know in your debate with Foster, you mentioned that you are very pro ceasefire, as am I. And one of the criticisms has been levied, like, how do we keep Israel safe while also ensuring the dignity of Palestinians if Hamas is still around? Um, and I was wondering if you could give your response on that, and then I'll have a follow-up question.
Well, I've been adamant on ceasefire and release of all hostages and release of all Palestinian prisoners who are, many of them, children in Israeli prisons. Many of them have not been charged. And let's be clear, there are thousands who have been not charged, no due process of law afforded. The question about how do we maintain the safety of both peoples is, I think, one that's been answered numerous times. I remember after the last Israel-Hamas war in May of 2021, I even tweeted this out. My tweet is still floating around out there somewhere. I said something to the effect of, there's now a ceasefire. And I use that word ceasefire. Hamas rockets have stopped. Israel bombing has stopped. Now, nothing is stopping Israel from removing its illegal settlements on Palestinian land and ending its illegal military occupation of Palestine. It's critical to recognize that both what Hamas did on October 7th was a war crime, and that this injustice has existed long before October 7th as well. Since May of 2021, Israel did not remove its military occupation, right? It did not end its illegal settlements. In fact, it just announced it's building 3,400 more homes, illegal settlements on Palestinian land. This is a violation of international human rights law. Hamas didn't exist for the first 20 years of the occupation. It is a reaction to the occupation. This is a reaction to a perpetual, decades-long violation of international human rights law. And it keeps Israel less safe, and it keeps Palestinians less safe. We need to ensure that we are holding our own allies. And if Israel is our ally, we need to hold them accountable to international human rights law. Otherwise, we lose our own moral standing here as well. The constant question is asking what Palestinians will do. Yes, but let's also ask what Israelis are doing in the situation. It needs to be parity in this conversation. And the big difference between my opponent and I is that while he and I both agree that Israel is violating international human rights law, I'm the only one with the courage, the conviction, the confidence to say that now let's hold them accountable to international human rights law. And that begins with a ceasefire and unconditional release of all hostages and Palestinian prisoners as well, who you could easily call hostages as well. And then an end to the occupation and the settlements. In his 16 years in Congress, I could not find a single example where he's called for an end to the occupation and an end to the settlements. Not one example. I couldn't find a single example of him calling to release Palestinian children indefinitely detained in Israeli prisons. He is far from someone who's speaking from a position of justice and honesty here. And I think it's important that people recognize that if you truly want safety and security for the people of Israel, and if you truly want safety and security for the people of Palestine, that happens by upholding justice, not by playing favorites.
Well, you kind of answered the question that I was going to do a follow up, so thank you for that. I I know you have to go soon since you're very busy. But just on another note, one of the things that has unfortunately come as a result of this conflict is that we've seen people use it to justify their prejudices, but particularly Islamophobia as well as anti-Semitism. Strangely enough, there are people who are convinced that I am Jewish. So that's a little interesting. But in terms of what your role has been and what your role will be in combating that, particularly if you're elected to Congress, what can we do? What can we as organizers and as Americans do to effectively combat these prejudices and make sure that they don't become cyclical towards one another?
I mean, I don't think there's a simple solution to that. I think it starts by engaging in dialogue. And I think that's where I go back to the need for ceasefire through diplomacy. And we're seeing the evidence of that in this siege of Gaza, which is now going on for almost 6 months. 30,000 civilians killed. 70% of them are women and children. The pro-war crowd keeps screaming, "Well, we need to release the hostages, release the hostages." Okay, let's look at that. The bombing has released 2 hostages. 2, right? The ceasefire released 136 safely. Anybody with common sense who's committed to peace will say, okay, if we really want to release all the hostages, then that happens through peace and diplomacy. And look, every war in the history of humanity, all the way back from like Roman times to the Revolutionary War to World War One, World War Two, Vietnam, every war ends in a ceasefire, right? Without fail, it ends in a ceasefire by sides who don't necessarily trust one another, but that's how it ends in a ceasefire, because they recognize that we can save more lives and build a better future with a ceasefire. And so when that is the history and the proven model, let's follow that and let's engage in meaningful dialogue. Let's engage in meaningful discourse. That's really the path forward. I'm proud of my record as a human rights lawyer to have stood with my fellow Jewish neighbors against anti-Semitism. When there was the spate of attacks on Jewish cemeteries, I took my mosque community to Jewish cemeteries to help clean up and stand in solidarity with our Jewish sisters and brothers. I sit on the board, likewise, of a nonprofit that works on ending the occupation. And I've traveled to Israel and to the occupied Palestinian territories to work with Jewish leaders and Israeli leaders and Arab leaders and Muslim Palestinian leaders on reconciling and building bridges of understanding and dialogue. This is the work I've been doing. And I can tell you the vast majority of people want peace. They want dialogue. This is why it's critical that we elect leaders who ensure that the will of the people becomes the law of the land, not the will of corporations and special interests.
Well, thank you very much for joining me. I really appreciate it, and I'd love to have you back on. This has been wonderful. If you would like to make any final remarks or anything, I'm more than happy to.
We're running a 100% people-funded campaign. We're down to the last 3 weeks. Election day is 3 weeks from today. If you're in district, go vote now. And I can't emphasize this enough. Grab 10 of your friends and take them with you. We also would love volunteers. So if you want to get involved, phone banking, text banking, postcard writing, reach out to us through our website, QasimRashid.com. We're available at Qasim Rashid. And Connor, it's great to have you on the team as well. And let's go out and win this thing on March 19th.
Absolutely. See you in the field soon.